Before we jump into today's video, I just want to let everyone out there know that every video this week was pre-recorded in advance. So things may have changed in between me recording this video and uploading it. Shouldn't be that big of a deal. Just wanted to kind of have this disclaimer in front of my videos this week, just so everybody knows what the deal is. But let's get into the video now. Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I wanted to talk a bit about what we saw recently in the Overwatch League Pro-Am. Specifically, I want to highlight some of the players from the Contenders teams that impressed me the most that I would like to see on an Overwatch League roster at some point in the 2023 season or beyond. For this video, I'm going to stick to the players who are Overwatch League eligible now. So that means no players like Infected or Tree will be in this video, but they obviously will be Overwatch League eligible in future seasons. And when they are eligible, then maybe we will add them to future lists. But for now, we're going to focus on the Contenders talent that is Overwatch League eligible going into the 2023 season. I also want to highlight specifically players who are Contender-specific players. Some players, of course, have been in the Overwatch League in the past and are back in Contenders. So I will talk about some of those guys who I was most impressed by. But I will always mention a player who has only been in Contenders, who has not managed to get to the Overwatch League before. Those will also be mentioned in these videos, or this video. So I'm going to be doing this by group. So I'll be going from A through D. And we're going to start from Group A with the team that finished, I believe, fourth in the group, and that is Timeless. They had quite an interesting run, falling short to everyone but Trick Room in their group. Interesting roster, but to me, the two players that were most kind of note were Wub and Cal. Wub, of course, was a player on the Eternal last year. I thought he was fine on the team. He definitely did not have the best look on that roster, though I don't think that is really his issue when you consider just how bad that Vegas, or I guess at the time Paris Eternal roster was last year. But I thought it looked pretty good in his time in the Pro-Am, even against teams like the Shock. I thought he looked pretty good. I thought he was kind of consistently one of the best pieces for this Timeless roster. But I really think one of the big stars was Cal, flex support player. Certainly the type of player that I could see getting picked up by a team like Vancouver, who I think really is in need of a secondary flex support. I just don't think Faith is really an exceptional level flex support. So I think someone like Cal could be a good addition. And I thought he looked very good in their series win over Trick Room. It's been a little bit now, but this is a player that I was very impressed by when I was watching it. He is not a player that I was familiar with prior to the Pro-Am. I didn't watch a ton of Contenders. Historically, I don't watch a ton of Contenders. I try to keep up with it at the very least, kind of follow the best teams in NA and in Korea in particular. So this is a player that I have not really been super familiar with his kind of history in the league. But I thought he played very, very well. I thought he was a very solid flex support player. Someone who really impressed me in his just kind of ability to make plays as a kind of pretty solid flex support player. And yeah, his best series was against another team in the Contenders region, the team that came from Contenders. But all in all, I thought he played pretty well. And so I figured give a huge shout to a guy who I was very impressed by on that team. So Wub and Cal, to me, the two big guys from Timeless. Timeless, like I said, they struggled quite a bit. They weren't really able to find much success. But their big win as a team came from that game over Trick Room, and I thought the Cal was a huge part of that. I think he was player of the match in that game because he played very, very well. So those are kind of the guys that I had my eyes on. I thought Wub had some moments where he really did kind of put the team on his back in some ways, and so always nice to see a big win from a kind of Contenders team, and then also kind of getting to see some Contenders players shine against some Overwatch teams as well, which is always nice to see. Mentioned them a couple times already. Trick Room, the other team from Group A. There really are two teams from that roster that I want to mention the most, and it is their DPS duo of Pummy and Boat. Their game against the Shock was very, very good. These two players in particular look very, very good. They're both, interestingly enough, they're both like known a lot for their hit scan, but Boat on Tracer, which is what he played for the majority of the kind of time in the Pro-Am, looked pretty good. I don't want to say he diffed proper in the way that everyone else has been, but it was good. They both played very, very well, and I think that they were kind of two of the best parts for this team. I thought Boat in particular played really, really well. I thought he was kind of the star for this roster, but I thought Pummy also looked very, very good on kind of the hit scan roles. It was a very interesting kind of matchup to watch with Trick Room when they won. It was a surprise, right? Like, it was shocking when Trick Room beat Shock, just because the Shock are, perennial top-level teams. They're one of the best teams consistently in the Overwatch League. They're two-time champions. They were grand finalists last year. It's a team that you expect to be really, really good, even on high ping. But this was genuinely a game where the Trick Room guys and Pummy and Boat in particular really did a lot to kind of bring the team on their back, kind of carry the team in a lot of ways, and just kind of have a good performance. And so they're two guys I certainly have my eyes on going into this kind of season. Maybe they find their way onto a roster this season, maybe it's next year, but they're two guys that I think really are impressive in terms of how they play. And I thought that their work was very, very good, and so thought I would give them a shout for their role on the Trick Room roster and helping that team get a win over the San Francisco Shock. Let's move on to Saints, one of the two best performing teams in the Contenders region for the Pro-Am qualifiers, and obviously one of the two Contenders teams to walk away with the $5,000 prize that the Contenders teams split. 3 players I want to highlight from this team. 2 of them are former Overwatch League players, so it is a little bit different for them. The other one, of course, is not. Some good players on this Saints roster. It's really interesting to kind of see a Contenders team that is usually pretty good kind of find as much success as they did, which is pretty interesting to see. So I really want to shout out mikeyy and King first. They're 2 of the guys who have been pretty consistently high performing players. I think they're very, 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 very good at kind of what they do. They're definitely not players who are perfect in every single sense, but we know mikeyy is a guy who had been getting offers for other teams. It's been kind of talked about kind of at length that mikeyy could have rejoined the league if he wanted to, but he chose to go to collegiate and pursue kind of some stuff there to be able to kind of have more flexibility really in his career path. King, a guy who I thought was really, really good last year for Vancouver. I thought when he joined the team, he played really, really well. I think he still looks very good. I think a team like Vegas would be really good with King on there. Some more kind of flex DPS, kind of flexibility. Something that I really want to kind of highlight for what this team has. What's interesting about Saints is a lot of what we saw from them comes from 2 pretty young star players. Of course, Tree, really, really good, too young. Vega, another guy, too young to play in the league yet. He's also only 16. But they also have another player by the name of Squid, who is their flex support. He joined this team pretty close to the start of the tournament, like right before the tournament began. So we didn't really have the time with the team that you would have expected, and I thought he played pretty well. So I kind of wanted to give him a shout out, mostly because if he was able to kind of play that well in a very limited amount of time, that's something that I think is kind of worth noting. We didn't see a whole bunch of kind of roster swapping outside of like the tanks. I'm pretty sure it was King and Tree the entire time they played. So to me, like, Squid is one of the only players on this team that is a Contenders player who's never been in the Overwatch League, who really has any shot at making the league soon. And I thought that the fact that he joined as recently as he did and looked decent, was a pretty big accomplishment. So I'm pretty happy with what we saw out of Squid. It was interesting to kind of see this team perform without CJ, who was a huge part of this team's success going into the Pro-Am. But this is an interesting team because I really think the two main players I really thought looked really, really good were mikeyy and King, and I thought Vega looked very good as well. But like I said, Vega, a little too young to be in the league. So I just wanted to shout out these guys because I thought they played well. And I think that they're all very, very, very strong Contenders talent who I think really should have had another shot in the league, whether they choose to or not, when it comes to mikeyy versus King. I don't know what King's offseason was like. I don't know if he had opportunities or anything like that. But I also think going to play for a collegiate team is a good idea. So I'm not going to criticize anyone for choosing to go to collegiate, but definitely unfortunate to not get to see mikeyy or King in the league this year. Curious to see if Vega gets, if we get anything from anyone else on that roster, but specifically Squid, like I said. Moving on, let's talk about the players from WISP that impressed me the most. WISP was the 5th place team in the Pro-Am qualifiers, one of the last teams to qualify. But I thought they had a decent run. I mean, they were definitely better than I think most people expected them to be. They didn't perform particularly well against, a lot of the Overwatch League teams, right? They were arguably the weakest team in the entire Pro-Am going into it just based on their results. But they won against Team Peps pretty convincingly. And I thought they had some pretty good performances from their roster. The guy who I was most impressed by was Rokit, damage player. His tracer was really, really good, and I thought that he was a very interesting player to watch. I'd be curious to kind of see what he's able to do going forward. He's a guy I'm going to kind of have my eyes on. I don't necessarily think he's going to be on any Overwatch League team anytime soon, but I did think he played pretty well. I did think he was an interesting player to watch. If memory serves me correctly, I know he's he duos quite a bit with Xerion, who of course is on New York Excelsior, but Xerion used to be on WISP, so they kind of have some some friendship there. So it's interesting to see this team and kind of how they improve over time. It'll be kind of interesting to see what this team is. But Rokit to me was pretty impressive. The other two players that were interesting were Jakaru and Abheek. Now, they are players who are UK-based players, so they're from the UK, and so I think these two are probably going to be on Team UK if I had to guess. Jakaru is probably the best tank right now in the UK, and Abheek is really the only flex support that I can think of from the UK that plays at a pretty high level. So I expect to see these two guys in the World Cup, but I enjoyed watching them play. I thought they looked very good. I thought WISP was a pretty decently performing team, considering they were in a pretty tough group with some really good teams. They had Boston and the Gladiators and Justice. But these were three of the players that I really did think played very well throughout the Pro-Am. And it's hard to judge Contenders players sometimes when they're up against Overwatch League talent. And their setups are never nearly as good. They're always playing in kind of worse conditions because, Contenders teams just simply don't have the same resources that Overwatch League talent gets. So it'll be interesting to kind of see where we kind of go with some of these players, but I'm really excited, in particular with Jakaru and Abheek, to see what they do in the World Cup. Because a lot of the Contenders talent, especially in like the US, isn't going to end up on the World Cup roster because there's so much Overwatch League level talent in the US or in South Korea, for example, or China. But it's regions like the UK, or Europe in general that has a lot of kind of talent spread across a bunch of different countries. And so it'll be cool to see some of these guys who we got to see in the Pro-Am play at a pretty high level, make it into the World Cup, and we'll see what they're able to do. So those are two guys. For that reason, I'm really interested to kind of see them. But Rokit, to me, was really the kind of MVP for this team. I thought he played very, very well, especially on his tracer, and a player I'm very interested to see kind of what his future holds, because he looked, in my opinion, to be among the best kind of Contenders players in the second weekend of matches. Next is Team Peps. They did not have a good Pro-Am, so it was very, very hard for any of their players in particular to shine in a really kind of great light. And it's unfortunate because this is a team that, of course, has a ton of history. This is a team that has a ton of, talent that just ended up in the Overwatch League. Players like Ben Best and FD God. So it is unfortunate. But I wanted to shout out Xerion. He is the French flex support for this team. He's pretty good. Everything I've seen of him, he looks pretty good. He's a pretty solid player. And I think that we're going to see him just continue to get better from here on out. I think that the team is really interesting. They're very interestingly built. There's an Overwatch League, talent in it, like Kelix and Naga, two guys who've been in the Overwatch League before, Hybrid, Molf. Then you've, Krondop as kind of their main tank. So they're an interesting team that I'm curious to kind of see how they continue to build upon what they are. And in all, to kind of look at things in a certain way, a lot of this roster is pretty recently put together, right? Like Ben Best, Suyo, FD God all left back in February. One of their coaches left. They lost, Getamaze last year, late in the year. So Xerion, Hybrid, Molf, Krondop, Kelix all joined only a couple of months ago. So it is interesting to kind of see where this team goes from here. I'm kind of intrigued to see how this team builds from what they were kind of this tournament, because they really just didn't have the success that you would expect. But part of that just comes from the fact that they're very, very new. They're very newly put together. Most of the guys on this team have only been on this team since late February. So I expect this team to be back when it comes to the Pro-Am in the middle of the year. And I think that Xerion, for me, is just the most interesting player on this team because he's one of the only guys on this roster that doesn't have Overwatch League experience. And I thought that he was one of the pieces that looked decent during this tournament. Like I said, Team Pep struggled a lot, and it'll be interesting to see kind of where they go from here. Because really, there's a lot to hope for from this roster, especially for the European fans. And I know that European fans love their players, love their French fans, love their players especially. So we'll see where things go, but definitely have my eyes on Xerion from this team. The team I think was the most interesting Contenders team in the Pro-Am was Twisted Minds. Of course, the team made up of players predominantly from Saudi Arabia, but there are some pretty solid players on this roster that many people are going to probably be seeing in the World Cup later this year. The big name to me really on this roster, the guy who I was most impressed by, was KSAA. Of course, he was back in the Overwatch League in 2020 as a member of the Vancouver Titans. I thought he was really, really good. I was surprised when they released him, and he still looks really good. I thought he looked incredible during the Pro-Am. I'm surprised a team like New York, who I think needs an off-tank, doesn't have him on their roster. So very, very impressed by what we saw out of KSAA. But obviously he's been in the Overwatch League before. So to highlight some of the people who haven't, Slay, Danish flex support, he looks pretty good. He was pretty good in their series, their 2 wins in the Pro-Am. I expect him to be in the World Cup on Team Denmark alongside someone like Shockwave and Naga, right? Some big names, Kelix. That's kind of the team that I expect to be a part of that roster. I think this is going to be really interesting to watch. I'm very excited for Team Denmark in the World Cup, and Slay I think is going to be a huge part of that roster. The other guy on this roster that I was really impressed by was Youbi. His Tracer looked really, really good. Throughout the tournament, he played very well. He was the DPS player that they didn't sub out. Obviously, Lambda, LBBD, however you want to pronounce it, he was the kind of main focal point for this team in those Pharah-centric comps. But one of the most impressive things about Twisted Minds was when they switched off of that comp, which a lot of people thought they probably wouldn't switch it off very often. But they did, and they played a lot of, King's Row with Youbi on Tracer. They played, I know the one push map they played against Redbird was Youbi played Tracer, and he looked really good on it. So 2 players from this team, Youbi and KSAA, and a lot of the players probably will be on Team Saudi Arabia in the World Cup. But those two in particular, KSAA and Youbi, are the two that I was most impressed by from this team. And I absolutely think KSAA is an Overwatch League level player. The fact that he's not on a team right now is really disappointing, because I think he has shown just how talented he is as a player. And I would definitely be excited to see him make his way back into the league one more time. The final team is Redbird Esports. They also had a pretty difficult time in the Pro-Am, but the player who I was the most impressed by, this shouldn't be a surprise really at all, that is Vision. Vision's play was so good. He had like a 5K as Cassidy on a Colosseo. It doesn't happen, right? That is not something that usually happens. Redbird, they had a rough weekend, obviously. They had a hurricane or a tornado, and they had a whole bunch of things they had to deal with when it came to this roster, and some of the disastrous kind of weekend for them, playing a lot of games, long weekend on Saturday, Sunday, 4 games across those 2 days. Definitely tough for them. They had a decently tough group as well. New York, Toronto, and Houston. So definitely not a ton of opportunity for this team to shine. But Vision did show up, and he looked great. And I think he is a player who I am very, 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 very interested to see if he makes it into the Overwatch League. I think there's a very good chance that he does find his way in. If there's any team that has kind of a hit scan hole, who knows what happens with Vegas. If Vegas feels like their team is a little weak in certain areas during the season, they didn't have a great showing, or even a team like Vancouver, if they want to go for a second hit scan player, Vision could be that guy. I really did think he was really, really good. I thought he had a really good weekend. To me, he was one of the standout Contenders players, period. Even though his team struggled, Vision really stood out to me. He played alongside Lethal on this team for a while, so it'll be interesting, especially to see kind of where this team goes, and kind of what they have in store for the future. Obviously, you would have loved to see them play without the kind of tornado that they had to deal with. But Vision, to me, really, really good player. Really excited to see what happens with him in the future. And it'll be interesting to kind of see what his team or what his future holds for the Overwatch League. That's really my thoughts, though, on these players. Just some names that kind of impressed me that I was intrigued by. Let me know in the comments down below your thoughts on any of the players that I've talked about. Interesting ones, obviously, throughout the league. I think the Saints guys in particular are kind of the most interesting ones, who I think really are probably the most realistic shot to see some of them in the league. But also, I think the World Cup is a really great stage, and we'll kind of keep an eye on where some of these guys end up. I mean, Cal, I know, literally as I'm recording this video, Team Canada dropped their roster, and Cal is on that roster, for example, with Magic Mateball, another guy who was on Trick Room. So we're seeing some of those guys find their way into the World Cup, which is really cool. And we're going to see a bunch of these players, hopefully in the future, make it into the into the Overwatch League as well. World Cup is a stepping stone to the Overwatch League sometimes, and so I'm hoping that for some of these guys who do manage to get that spot in the World Cup, they also find that spot in the Overwatch League. But yeah, like I said, let me know in the comments down below your thoughts on any of these players. If there's anyone that you really, really liked, anyone you didn't like as much, whatever it is, just let me know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video and want to like it in the future, consider liking and subscribing, because that does help out a bunch with the channel. But that is going to be all from me for today. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.